Welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast, where we highlight the integration of psychology and psychological principles into the world of business and organizations. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. I'm excited for you to meet my guest today because he's the current president of the Society for Psychologists in Leadership. He is Dr. Bradley Brummel. Dr. Brummel is also professor of psychology at the University of Houston. He received his PhD in industrial organizational psychology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Brummel also works as a coach. He has certifications in Hogan assessments and narrative coaching from the Moment Institute. Dr. Brummel's research interests include leader development, personality, employee engagement, sexual harassment, and cybersecurity. Dr. Bradley Brummel, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Ernest. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to have you on the show because I actually met you when I came to the first meeting, for me at least, of SPL. And I think that's when you were becoming president. And I really enjoyed everybody there. But I always want to start the show by asking about you. So tell us a little bit about how you went from doing research and working in academia to leading SPL.
Yeah, so in industrial organizational psychology, I've always been an applied psychologist in that a lot of my questions and work have been with companies. And when you're a researcher, it's really great when you can work with companies and then they pay you for that work. And then you get data that can contribute to knowledge. So that's like the ideal situation.
Yeah.
But I've always been driven by answering questions that companies have a little bit more than people who really read the literature and try to solve a basic problem or something that's like the next thing in the literature. And so that put me in positions to work directly with companies. So in graduate school, we did some leadership development work with assessment centers. And then I did some work in employee engagement surveys, which led me into doing that kind of work while doing my professor job. And then after I got tenure in 2015, I really felt drawn to do more direct work with people. So it's nice when people say that your research helped them, but you don't feel it for years after you've actually done it. And you're like, What did I do again?
Yeah.
And so I had done some work in coaching and I started to intentionally invest in some certifications, in some work. And honestly, people would trade me food for advice by our pool in our apartment complex. And then they're like, you should do this for more than food. And so I started to invest in that piece. And as I did more coaching work, I also wanted to find other people doing similar things. And that really drew me to SPL because that's a group of psychologists who are working sort of as leaders or in coaching and development with leaders. And so they're sort of a kindred tribe to the kind of work I've begun to do more of.
Yeah, that's a really great story. I love the transition that you made there in terms of collecting data and working with people, and just finding out, hey, this what you're doing is valued and appreciated, and really doing that professionally. You touched on something that I really want to ask about a little bit because I've had other guests and we've talked about the importance of data. You know, as a psychologist, we value data and we use data, and we've talked a lot about doing that at the individual level. But you're talking about using data in an organizational level. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so there's two sides to that. So individual psychological assessment and testing is what we do a lot of in, say coaching or in clinical work to really know how this person you're working with might be different than other people. And that can be helpful for your approach. And it can also be helpful to give that person insight. At an organizational level, you're kind of trying to get a sense of how your organization works. And one of the biggest traps I think a leader can fall into is say, no one ever came and told me about X, so it must not be real. And so people rarely feel the power on the other side of the desk when they have it. And so I've worked with many leaders who have said, I am so surprised that this complaint came up in the engagement survey. No one told me.
Yeah.
Well, most of the time when you have a complaint, it's not safe to talk to a leader, even the most skilled safe ones, because you might have been punished in the past. You don't know what's going to happen. They might not take it seriously. And so just saying, I'm available, come tell me anything, doesn't mean you're getting a accurate and broad picture of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really need to create safe ways to survey the full organization. And then if you don't act on that information and explain to people what you're doing with it, people will also just stop telling you.
Mm-hmm.
And so understanding that the information that gets brought to you is highly curated, and often the punches are pulled. And so there are a variety of ways to get around those blind spots as a leader,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not a natural thing to do.
Yeah.
So that's the data I've worked most to bring to organizations have been broad things on employee engagement, so how people are feeling and acting and investing in the organization, and then research as well on sexual harassment, which is something people have all kinds of very valid reasons for not reporting.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying, especially because it reminds me of the time right after COVID, or right in the middle of COVID, when keeping employees was really important. I think the sense of employee engagement and paying attention to that and really focusing on that became a really big thing at that time. And a lot of organizations that hadn't done any employee engagement assessments started looking for ways to assess their employees and get feedback from them. But very often they'd collect all this data and then they just wouldn't know what to do with it. And so I think that's where we can be really helpful as well in analyzing that data and understanding what to do with it.
Yeah, and in organizations who realize they have sort of turnover problems, often realize them, too late. They're like, well, and almost always it's your most ambitious sort of best people who are leaving when they realize that the organization kind of isn't fulfilling their psychological contract.
Yeah.
And so then all of a sudden you might say, if you're a big organization, you say, we don't have a turnover problem. It's only at whatever, 5 or 6%.
Mm-hmm.
But if you haven't measured your employees, you don't know which people are leaving.
Yeah.
And most of the time, the people you're losing are the ones that you might not want to.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, your organization is getting less skilled, even if it's not, say, compared to the rest of the industry at a huge or disproportionate rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really key point there, right? It's not just about your turnover rate. It's who is actually leaving, because in a lot of organizations, you have high performers and middle and low. And so if you're losing your high performers at a high rate, that should be really concerning. So it's important to track who is actually leaving.
Yeah, this is a little aside, but one of my favorite tools, which is deceptively simple, is something called like an internal labor market.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the way you do it is you sort of create the triangle of people at different levels in your organization. And every year you just look at how many were promoted, how many left, and how many came in from outside. And you can actually see if you have sort of roadblocks where there's really no opportunity to promote up, where you have a whole bunch of people ready to promote that maybe you need to even outplace them at that point in their career. And so there's these internal dynamics where if you trap someone who's ready to be promoted too long, then it's rational for them to go find where their growth can happen. If it's not in your organization, then sometimes having those people leave, if it goes on good terms, you'll have an advocate, and maybe that person will come back in 5 or 10 years with all these skills from outside. And so I think one of the mistakes organizations make, either they might say turnover is not a problem, it's not too big, or they say we want to keep everyone, and so they like hold on to them too tight.
Yeah, there's value in leaving the organization, learning something, and then bringing it back into the organization. I like that. Yeah. So, Brad, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is obviously you're president of Society of Psychologists and Leadership, which is something that I'm a member of and have really benefited from. But can you share a little bit about what it is and how this society is helpful to businesses and leaders?
Yeah, so the organization is a collection of psychologists working either as leaders or in leadership. And so we have people who typically people who started their career in psychology and then were pulled, pushed, drawn through some chance thing into positions of leadership where they're working primarily as leaders as opposed to as psychologists, either in a clinical psychology role or sort of the data analysis, organizational psychology role.
Yeah.
And then we have some people who actually were leaders and then, found psychology later and invested in that way. And most of these people end up somewhat isolated in either their role because they're working as independent consultants or with
Hmm.
small groups, or as leaders who are in leadership positions and approaching questions with the psychologist mindset, which is very different.
Yeah.
So the organization is heading into its 40th year of existence, and really it's a home for psychologist leaders to have camaraderie, to see what other people are doing, to have validation, ask hard questions,
Hmm.
and this really allows us to pull together across the country and across the world to continue our personal and professional development, and then
Hmm.
to really ask questions about how it is that we lead differently as psychologists. And again, what can we bring to these very complex, difficult, important decisions that
Yeah.
have huge impact in the world?
Yeah, I love that description. How do we lead as psychologists, and what can we bring, to leadership? And I also want to tag on something that you said in terms of the psychological mindset, right? I think that's one thing that I think is really important. Can you talk a little bit more about how you can get a leader to start looking at things with a psychological mindset, and how that can be very helpful to an organization and a business?
Yeah, it's really interesting to watch people move on these trajectories. So one example I had is I coached somebody who told me that the word perception should be banned from the dictionary because there was just truth, and as it turned out, there was like just his truth.
Hmm.
And he wasn't, so he was probably the smartest and hardest working person at his organization, but because there was just his way,
Yeah.
he went from managing 30 people to managing projects to no longer working in the company.
Mm.
And so a lot of people get into leadership through an individual contributor role. So you
Hmm.
get really good at engineering or finance or business or whatever you do. And after you do that, you get put in charge of 10 people or
Yeah.
so who are not as hardworking and not as smart as you.
Yeah.
And then that can be really frustrating and derailing. And then you start to realize it's not just knowing how to do your work that's important. It's trying to figure out how to lead and manage and motivate this team of people.
Hmm.
And that really opens the door to saying, wait a second, these people are different than me.
Hmm.
How do I do this?
Yes.
And so I think the biggest advantage we have as psychologists is we help people understand the psychological world in which
Hmm.
they're presuming and hoping to lead. And, I kind of, one shorthand I have for it is to say, when you look at a certain situation,
Hmm.
is to say, like, am I actually the jerk or the asshole here? Right? Because this other person thinks I'm wrong. I
Yeah.
think I'm right. What must be true about their world that
Hmm.
makes them believe that they're right? So it really opens this whole door of curiosity that you need if you're going to lead any other way than purely with power.
Hmm.
And in most organizations, most of the people aren't completely trapped.
Mm.
And so if you're not going to consider their broader options in an open system,
Hmm.
it's going to be a struggle.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I can talk for a long time about the different ways this functions, but you find leaders kind of often they're like at the end of their rope and frustrated. They're like, this person like can't hear me.
Hmm.
What's going on? And then that sort of, if they can approach it with curiosity, opens the door to different strategies, different approaches, insight into how they're being perceived, which is different than their intent, and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, all of that really resonates with me. I've talked at length and with multiple people about how you can be excellent at your specific job, whether it's a clinical or a technical or whatever it is that you're doing, because it's just you and you're just in control of you, and whatever it is that you're doing. And very often, as you said, when you do a really great job there, then you get promoted to managing other people doing that work. And that's a whole different skill that is not often accounted for. There's very often very little training for you to work and deal with people, how to manage yourself with a group of people and your frustrations. So I really feel like that's an area that's lacking, and an area where coaching and consulting can really play an important part.
Yeah, one of the things I've seen a lot is just because people do they wear so many hats, and what's good performance as a leader
Mm-hmm.
changes from meeting to meeting to meeting and from person to person.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I work with leaders, a lot of the initial first change is to actually say, what does it take for me to be in the right mindset and present
Mm-hmm.
for this meeting that's occurring? So one example I had of this was I was working with someone who had three people, his three main reports, and they were all very different. And he said, I keep getting into trouble because I keep treating them like the other ones and it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so this wasn't my suggestion, but he actually came up with this little trick for his meetings is to remember who they are. And he said that he had one who was a used car salesman, one was a one was a saint, and one was a baby. And he
Okay.
said, so the first 5 minutes of every meeting, I have to let the baby cry, the saint
Mm-hmm.
tell on someone, and the used car dealer lie to me. But after
Mm-hmm.
that, he's like, we can get work done. And, if the used car salesman comes in and is talking about someone who's breaking the rules or is crying, I need to pay attention to that
Mm-hmm.
because that's something different going on.
Yeah.
So, I'm like, I don't know if I would use those terms, and it kind of traps your people in your mind, but it does give you the idea that says, wait a second, I am most effective if
Mm-hmm.
I work differently with these people.
Yeah.
So you see that, and then a leader in this complex world has all these different roles. Like sometimes they have to tell people it's this way. Sometimes they have to sell. Sometimes they have to be kind and hold and listen.
Yeah.
And if you pick the wrong mindset, it won't go well. So
Mm-hmm.
one of my recent leaders was like a world class debate kind of champion. Like, and so the thing
Yeah.
was his favorite mindset was win this debate. But very rarely did someone come into his office hoping to have a debate
Yeah.
and wanting to match wits. And so when it wasn't clear what the context was, like he would flip into debate mode and he would win, and the person would shake their head and walk out of the
Yeah.
office knowing
They
they had
don't
lost the
care.
debate. But that was not good performance because that's not what the situation called for.
Yeah, that reminds me of a leadership model that I'm familiar with, Ken and Blanchard's decision making situational leadership approach, which really requires you to think about the person that you're working with and figure out technically and competently where are they? Are they somebody that needs a lot of hand holding, or someone who can be fairly independent? And there's a spectrum which allows you to determine your approach based upon what that employee or what that colleague requires and needs in terms of support from you. And so it really requires you to know that person well and understand where they are in terms of the competency scale, so that then you can adjust your approach. But I think, as you've described, that can be very hard for leaders to be able to adjust their own approach. Most of the time people have their own leadership style, and that's kind of what they stick to regardless of what the other people need, which can cause a lot of conflict.
Yeah, and there's a couple pieces there which I think are really helpful to unpack. So one of them is I have come to really like this differentiation between the golden rule and the platinum rule.
Mm-hmm.
And so the golden rule is to treat people how you want to be treated.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start to become more of a psychologically minded leader, you realize that not everyone thinks like you. And
Yeah.
so this platinum rule is to treat people how they want to be treated.
Mm-hmm.
But as you mentioned, that's really hard
Mm-hmm.
because you actually have to learn who they are, what their needs, values, and motives are,
Yeah.
and what they will respond to. So that then switches you into looking for ways of doing psychological measurement, ways
Mm-hmm.
of remembering who the person is, and actually collecting feedback in that way. So
Yeah.
that's a much harder way to lead. And then the second piece, which is out there, is just we call it like implicit leadership theories. So your idea about what a leader looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to lead differently than what everyone thinks a leader should do in your industry or in your company, it's kind of on you to explain it to people so that they still believe you're doing your job.
Mm-hmm.
So when I coach people, one of the things I talk to them about is, what do people in your organization think you should be doing? Like, is there a prototype?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to lead against a prototype, it's really helpful to let people know that,
Yeah.
and say it's intentional,
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise they think you're failing, but instead you're trying to show them a new, better way to do
Different
it,
way. Yeah.
or a way that's more authentic to you. And so I worked with one client, probably one of my favorite clients, kind of got promoted up 2 levels at once because of vacancies. Was a very different personality style than the person that she was replacing, and really wanted to do the job like as her.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really spent some time talking about who she had to explain this to, what she had to wear, how she had to carry herself, and the
Mm-hmm.
fact that she would have to remind the CEO multiple times that she was going to do the role differently than the person before her, who was
Yeah.
like this force of nature, and why, and what kind of support she would need. And it was a really healthy organization. And so they were actually allowed or able to do that with support. But it was a really interesting, intentional decision that I
Mm-hmm.
could then sort of support as it unfolded.
Yeah. So being very explicit in communicating, almost over communicating so that people understand what you're doing and that you're taking a different approach than others.
Yeah. And this one thing, it's so simple and we all know it, but our intention behind our behaviors is different than the impact and how it's received. And
Yes.
when you take that seriously, we're constantly going around having a different impact than we think.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we know that that's happening, then we have a chance to perhaps change it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really where the psychology, I think, comes in so strongly.
Yeah. Yeah, Brett, I know you're also a researcher, and I know you do a lot of research yourself. Do you have any research examples that you can share with us in terms of how psychology has had a great impact on business and business settings?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big area. Like, industrial organizational psychology has been, a field that affects the world in some ways for the last 130 years. We started, in the Industrial Revolution, kind of trying to help people perform more effectively for the same amount of money. And so there was sort of this corporate allegation that we were caring about the companies and not the people. And that ends up being a really interesting challenge for coaches and consultants,
Hmm.
because we're often getting paid by the company
Yeah.
to work with people. And as a psychologist, we care a lot about things like informed consent, respect for
Ethics.
persons,
Yeah.
doing no harm. And a lot of business decisions and leadership decisions are done without the consent of the people
Mm.
and might cause some versions of harm, job loss, things like this. And
Hmm.
so it's a really interesting tension there. I kind of drifted a little bit away from your question. I think the areas where we've shown maybe some of the largest impact
Hmm.
is just that selecting different people for different roles makes a difference.
Hmm.
So some people will be more likely to thrive in certain types of jobs than others, and will be happier in them. Their
Hmm.
values and need fits. And when you take that seriously, that creates a whole arm, and there's a huge industry around selection, but
Hmm.
also
Hmm.
in terms of placing people into roles. And so I think the biggest one of the biggest research findings could broadly be stated that we can do a better job than chance
Hmm.
or some informal process at helping fit people into roles to be successful
Hmm.
for both the company and for their own well-being. So we're always balancing both things. As psychologists, how do we make sure people are thriving in roles
Hmm.
and that the company is succeeding?
Yeah, I love what you're saying in terms of psychology and its impact, especially on selection, because I think, especially in the business, and especially as you get higher and higher and bigger, the leadership of a business is so critical, and the getting the right leader in the right place at the right time is absolutely essential. And I think it's absolutely pivotal to have that help in terms of selection to make sure that you're selecting not just the right person, but the right person for the right company at the right time.
Yeah, and I think there's that issue in selection, and then there is a little bit of a bias towards selecting someone who can do this job as prescribed right
Hmm.
now. But there's also this question around um, developability and who the
Hmm.
person might become. And so one of the tensions is, should you hire the person who can become the best person for your company
Yeah.
through multiple roles across time? So
Hmm.
you're selecting someone into the company for a role, but you're going to select them because of um,
Potential.
their potential,
Hmm.
as opposed to what they can do right now.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of companies fall into the trap of hiring someone who can do the job as it's listed,
Mm.
especially with the screen out techniques they have now on HR softwares. If you don't
Yeah.
have all the competencies and experience, they won't take you in. But you might be someone who could be a leader of the company someday because you're
Hmm.
smart, you're driven, you have the personality characteristics that allow you to thrive in the role. And so I really try to encourage companies to think about, are you hiring a cog to fill this hole, this job? Or are you
Hmm.
hiring someone who fits the culture of the company, who's going to, whichever role you have them in, over the next 20 years, change your
Hmm.
trajectory? And I think companies tend to hire people for skills and abilities that can be trained really quickly, and
Mm.
then sacrifice on attributes which are harder to change and really important for long term contribution. Like, is
Hmm.
somebody kind? Is somebody hardworking? Some of these things you might not screen in. And so you end up with a whole bunch of people who can only do the one job that they have right now. And with technology changing, that job might not be relevant in 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah. So really important to hire for fit in the culture, right? Because as you're saying, you can train some of those other skills pretty quickly.
Yeah, we get squeamish a little bit about the term character, because we're saying some people have better character than others.
Hmm.
But when you want to say character for being a member of this organization or accomplishing this role ethically, well, training other people, working well in teams, I think it's probably an accurate label for what we're trying to do.
Mm. Yeah. Brad, we could talk on forever, going on with this stuff. You and I always just go on back and forth with this, but I want to be respectful of time. So I'm going to ask, how do people get a hold of you? Because I know that you're out there doing your own work and you're doing great work. So how do people get a hold of you if they want to, hire your
Yeah,
services or chat with you?
sure. The two easiest ways are through LinkedIn, because I have a profile there, or with a direct email.
Hmm.
So you can email me at my university account, which is just bjbrummel at uh.edu, as I just am new to the Houston area. And then, yes, that's the main way. And then from there, I like to have discussions about um, research and psychology. Obviously, you can tell from this podcast.
Yeah.
So I start almost everything with the general conversation. And when I do professional work or coaching work, um, it's I always determine fit first.
Hmm.
So if someone doesn't fit with me, then there's somebody else out there that's
Yeah.
probably a better person. And so one of the things I've had the luxury of doing is not really having to like hustle or advertise for work,
Yeah.
because I really do the consulting and leadership side to supplement my exposure and knowledge of the field. So I ask
Hmm.
better research questions, and then also just for the joy of sort of learning people's lives, helping them, nudging them towards growth. Uh,
Yeah. I love that approach. It's a learning approach, right? You're helping and learning at the same time.
yeah, it's a pretty. I feel very fortunate to get to do this work.
Excellent. And then I always ask everybody who comes on the show because we have you on for free advice, right? So, what advice or what tip would you give up to leaders or organizations right now in this environment?
So the current thing that's probably freshest on my mind is ideas around boundary management,
Mm.
because technology allows everyone to be present in everything at once, but also maybe never really focused. Yeah, it
Hmm.
gets into some of these deep work ideas. And what companies do is I really think that it's important for them to be clear-eyed and honest about what a role requires. So in most organizations, there are jobs where you have to be there in person, maybe 40 hours a week to accomplish a task. And then
Mm-hmm.
there's other roles where you don't really need to be there. You're kind of always working, but you never have to be working. Sometimes it aligns with this sort of hourly versus salary distinction, but not
Yeah.
always. And if a company isn't very clear with how they expect boundaries to work, it's going to be chaos across
Mm-hmm.
the organization. So my colleague and I actually just wrote a chapter on what we call like strategic boundary management.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about how your company is going to help their employees manage work, non-work boundaries.
Mm.
Do they get to choose within a unit? Are there specific rules? Do specific roles have this issue? Because there's so many justice concerns about some people who have to be in the office or on the plant floor and some
Yeah.
people who don't. And what does that mean? So one of my friends actually transitioned from being a worker, like a manager within a
Mm-hmm.
plant, to the plant manager.
Mm.
And he thought he had to be the first one there and the first one out and also available all weekend because he was in charge of everything,
Yeah.
right? But the luxury that you have to be able to take to keep your life and your family balanced then is that actually you can't be there all the time. You're supposed to
Mm-hmm.
be able to use the flexibility because you always have to be available.
Yeah.
And so I think that so many people are really confused about what's okay and not okay at their company. I had a company where the CFO said, "Hey, I want this to be family first. If you need to stay home, take care of a kid, do something with your family. Make sure you do that, and we can work around when you work." This is like an engineering company, but
Mm.
he stayed home to do stuff with his kids one day. Came in at 10:30 and snuck in the side door so no one saw him. And my point was that if he was really trying to lead the company, he should have came in the front door and told every single person that he had done
Mm-hmm.
this
Yeah.
because he claimed it was the rule, but then he didn't live it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that this question around in the office, not in the office, those are all going on. But companies have both types of employees. And
Yeah.
if you're not clear with them that if you have to be here 9 to 5, then we do not contact you on the weekends. And actually, we don't want you sending emails. We want you to take that break and live your life so that when you're working, you're here, both
Yeah.
mentally and physically. But if you have a role that we kind of need to be able to contact you, when you're on throughout the week, then yeah, if you have to go to the dentist at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday or you have to stay late, make sure you flex that time and
Mm-hmm.
don't lose the family life. And so I really think that companies can have a strategic advantage if they're clear-eyed about this, and then they throughout the organization get their supervision to enforce and model
Yeah.
whatever version of that they've come to, because otherwise people will take advantage and just kind of
Mm-hmm.
not work if they're skilled, or they'll just be constantly on at work, which relates to some of this burnout
Yeah.
phenomena that you hear a lot of. And
Yeah.
so that's that piece where I've seen very few companies that have been really serious and strategic about how that works in their organization.
Yeah, I really love that, and I think that's really important advice because since COVID, almost every workplace is a hybrid workplace now, right? And so I think it's really important to be very clear about what the flexibility rules are and help people find the balance. I think you have to be explicit in helping people find the balance because we don't always do a good job of that. Sometimes the people who work, your high performers will overdo it and work too hard, and some of the people who are a little bit less will take too much flexibility. So really helping people figure out where the balance is and how that impacts their home life as well as the work environment, and how that's really critical, as you're saying, to use that as a strategic advantage, right, in the business is really important. So I really love that advice.
Yeah, and I think there's maybe a tangible example here, which is sort of speaks to a lot of what psychology and leadership can help people unpack.
Hmm.
And that's these companies that have unlimited time off,
Yeah.
right? So they have unlimited time off and they say, this is great. Actually, when we move to unlimited time off, people take less time off, right? And so this is one of those findings where they're like, oh, this is great. We can tell them they have unlimited time off, but we're going to con them into working even more.
Hmm.
Because they don't really know what the rules are, because there is a certain amount of time you take off where you're just going to get fired.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's a version, they call it strategic ambiguity. But then no one can ever say for sure, like, oh, my boss, my company, the agreement we have is that they want me to disconnect and take this time off and refresh. And so it just creates chaos and a lack of real sort of footing for someone to know that what they're doing isn't going to hurt them.
Yeah.
And then the supervisor doesn't know what they can say about somebody who needs to be somewhere to get a project out. And so I think that it's a kindness for a company and for a leader to make those expectations clear.
Yeah.
And it also highlights how, there's a certain version of psychology and leadership that can be used pretty manipulatively. And there's other versions that can be used to really empower the workers.
Yeah.
And so that's a balance that's always there in these spaces.
Yeah, I love, it's so funny. You were just talking about unlimited time off. And I was just working with a client earlier this week where they were considering using unlimited time off. And we looked at data, and the data shows that actually nobody ever uses more time off. They actually use less, just because exactly what you're talking about. So, Brett, thank you so much for coming on the show. I love talking with you, and I'm really glad that our listeners got to hear you and learn from you. So I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ernest. It's been enjoyable as always.
Awesome. Well, we always have more to talk about, so we'll definitely just have to have you come back so we can talk more.
Sounds good. Anytime.
And to our listeners, thanks for listening. I hope you'll join us next time.